Chapter 3 Wood and Word. Coat was leafing idly through a book, trying to ignore the silence of the empty inn, when the door opened and Graham backed into the room. Just got done with it. Graham maneuvered through the maze of tables with exaggerated care. I was going to bring it in last night, but then I thought, one last bit of oil, rub it, and let dry. Can't say I'm sorry I did. Lord and lady, it's beautiful, as anything these hands have ever made. A small line formed between the innkeeper's eyebrows. Then, seeing the flat bundle in the man's arms, he brightened. "Ah, the mounting board," Coat smiled tiredly. "I'm sorry, Graham. It's been so long. I'd almost forgotten." Graham gave him a bit of a strange look. 4 months ain't long for wood all the way from Erin, not with the roads being as bad as they are. 4 months, Coat echoed. He saw Graham watching him and hurried to add, "That can be a lifetime if you're waiting for something." He tried to smile reassuringly, but it came out sickly. In fact, the innkeeper himself seemed rather sickly. Not exactly unhealthy, but hollow. Wan, like a plant that's been moved into the wrong sort of soil and, lacking something vital, has begun to wilt. Graham noted the difference. The innkeeper's gestures weren't as extravagant. His voice wasn't as deep. Even his eyes weren't as bright as they had been a month ago. Their color seemed duller. They were less sea foam, less green grass than they had been. Now they were like river weed, like the bottom of a green glass bottle. And his hair had just been bright before, the color of flame. Now it seemed red. Just red hair color, really. Coat drew back the cloth and looked underneath. The wood was a dark charcoal color with a black grain, heavy as a sheet of iron. 3 dark pegs were set above a word chiseled into the wood. Folly, Graham read. Odd name for a sword. Coat nodded, his face carefully blank. "How much do I owe you?" he asked quietly. Graham thought for a moment. "After what you've given me to cover the cost of the wood," there was a cunning glimmer in the man's eye, "around 1 3. Coat handed over 2 talents. "Keep the rest. It's difficult wood to work with." "That it is," Graham said with some satisfaction. "Like stone under the saw. Try a chisel, like iron. Then, after all the shouting was done, I couldn't char it." "I noticed that," Coat said with a flicker of curiosity, running a finger along the darker groove the letters made in the wood. "How did you manage it?" "Well," Graham said smugly, "after wasting half a day, I took it over to the smithy. Me and the boy managed to sear it with hot iron. Took us better than 2 hours to get it black. Not a wisp of smoke, but it made a stink like old leather and clover. Damnedest thing. What sort of wood don't burn?" Graham waited a minute, but the innkeeper gave no signs of having heard. "Where would he like me to hang it, then?" Coat roused himself enough to look around the room. "You can leave that to me, I think. I haven't quite decided where to put it." Graham left a handful of iron nails and bid the innkeeper good day. Coat remained at the bar, idly running his hands over the wood and the word. Before too long, Bast came out of the kitchen and looked over his teacher's shoulder. There was a long moment of silence, like a tribute given to the dead. Eventually, Bast spoke up. "May I ask a question, Reshi?" Coat smiled gently. "Always, Bast." "A troublesome question?" "Those tend to be the only worthwhile kind." They remained staring at the object on the bar for another silent moment, as if trying to commit it to memory. Folly. Bast struggled for a moment, opening his mouth, then closing it with a frustrated look, then repeating the process. "Out with it," Coat said finally. "What were you thinking?" Bast said with an odd mixture of confusion and concern. Coat was a long while in answering. "I tend to think too much, Bast. My greatest successes came from decisions I made when I stopped thinking and simply did what I felt right. Even if there was no good explanation for what I did." He smiled wistfully. "Even if there were very good reasons for me not to do what I did." Bast ran a hand alongside the side of his face. "So you're trying to avoid second-guessing yourself?" Coat hesitated. "You could say that," he admitted. "I could say that, Reshi," Bast said smugly. "You, on the other hand, would complicate things needlessly." Coat shrugged and turned his eyes back to the mounting board. "Nothing to do but find a place for it, I suppose." "Out here?" Bast's expression was horrified. Coat grinned wickedly, a measure of vitality coming back into his face. "Of course." He said, seeming to savor Bast's reaction. He looked speculatively at the walls and pursed his lips. "Where did you put it, anyway?" "In my room," Bast admitted. "Under my bed." Coat nodded distractedly, still looking at the walls. "Go get it, then." He made a small shooing gesture with one hand, and Bast hurried off, looking unhappy. The bar was decorated with glittering bottles, and Coat was standing on the now vacant counter between the 2 heavy oak barrels when Bast came back into the room, black scabbard swinging loosely from one hand. Coat paused in the act of setting the mounting board atop one of the barrels and cried out in dismay, "Careful, Bast! You're carrying a lady there, not swinging some wrench at a barn dance." Bass stopped in his tracks and dutifully gathered it up in both hands before walking the rest of the way to the bar. Coat pounded a pair of nails into the wall, twisted some wire, and hung the mounting board firmly on the wall. "Hand it up, would you?" he asked with an odd catch in his voice. Using both hands, Bast held it up to him, looking for a moment like a squire offering up a sword to some bright-armored knight. But there was no knight there, just an innkeeper, just a man in an apron who called himself Coat. He took the sword from Bast and stood upright on the counter behind the bar. He drew the sword without a flourish. It shone a dull gray white in the room's autumn light. It had the appearance of a new sword. It was not notched or rusted. There was no bright scratches skittering along its dull gray side, but though it was unmarred, it was old. And while it was obviously a sword, it was not a familiar shape. At least, no one in this town would have found it familiar. It looked as if an alchemist had distilled a dozen swords, and then the crucible had cooled. And when the crucible had cooled, this was lying in the bottom, a sword in its pure form. It was slender and graceful. It was deadly as a sharp stone beneath swift water. Coat held it a moment. His hand did not shake. Then he set the sword on the mounting board. Its gray-white metal shone against the dark roa behind it. While the handle could be seen, it was dark enough to be almost indistinguishable from the wood. The word beneath it, black against blackness, seemed a reproach. Folly. Coat climbed down, and for a moment he and Bass stood side by side, silently looking up. Bass broke the silence. "It is rather striking," he said, as if he regretted the truth, "but—" He trailed off, trying to find appropriate words. He shuddered. Coat clapped him on the back, oddly cheerful. "Don't bother being disturbed on my account." He seemed more lively now, as if his activity lent him energy. "I like it," he said, with sudden conviction, and hung the black scabbard from one of the mounting board's pegs. Then there were things to be done, bottles to be polished and put back in place, lunch to be made, lunch clutter to be cleaned. Things were cheerful for a while, in a pleasant, bustling way. The two talked of small matters as they worked, and while they moved around a great deal, it was obvious that they were reluctant to finish whatever task they were close to completing, as if they both dreaded the moment when the work would end and the silence would fill the room again. Then something odd happened. The door opened, and noise poured into the Waystone like a gentle wave. People bustled in, talking and dropping bundles of belongings. They chose tables and threw their coats over the backs of chairs. One man, wearing a shirt of heavy metal rings, unbuckled a sword and leaned it against a wall. 2 or 3 wore knives on their belts. 4 or 5 called for drinks. Coat and Bast watched for a moment, then moved smoothly into action. Coat smiled and began pouring drinks. Bast darted outside to see if there were horses that needed stabling. In 10 minutes the inn was a different place. Coins rang on the bar. Cheese and fruit were set on platters, and a large copper pot was hung to simmer in the kitchen. Men moved tables and chairs about to better suit their group of nearly a dozen people. Coat identified them as they came in. 2 men and 2 women, wagoners, rough from years of being outside and smiling to be spending the night out of the wind. 3 guards with hard eyes, smelling of iron. A tinker with a pot belly and a ready smile showing his few remaining teeth. 2 young men, one sandy-haired, one dark, well-dressed and well-spoken. Travelers sensible enough to hook up with the larger group for protection on the road. The settling in period lasted an hour or 2. Prices of rooms were dickered over. Friendly arguments started about who slept with whom. Minor necessities were brought in from wagons or saddlebags. Baths were requested and water heated. Hay was taken to the horses, and Coat topped off the oil in all the lamps. The tinker hurried outside to make use of the remaining daylight. He walked his 2-wheel mule cart through the town streets. Children crowded around, begging for candy and stories and shims. When it became apparent that nothing was going to be handed out, most of them lost interest. They formed a circle with the boy in the middle and started to clap, keeping the beat with a children's song that had been ages old when their grandparents had chanted it. When the hearth fire turns blue, what to do, what to do? Run outside, run and hide. Laughing, the boy in the middle tried to break out of the circle, while the other children pushed him back. Tinker, the old man's voice rang out like a bell. Pot mender, knife grinder, willow wand water finder, cut cork, mother leaf, silk scarves off the city streets, writing paper, sweetmeats. This drew the attention of the children. They flocked back to him, making a small parade as he walked down the street, singing, "Belt leather, black pepper, fine lace and bright feather. Tinker in town tonight, gone tomorrow, working through the evening light. Come, wife, come, daughter, I've small cloth and rose water." After a couple of minutes he settled outside the Waystone, set up his sharp-ringing wheel, and began to grind a knife. As the adults began to gather round the old man, the children returned to their game. A girl in the center of the circle put one hand over her eyes and tried to catch the other children as they ran away, clapping and chanting. When his eyes are black as crow, where to go, where to go? Near and far, here they are. The tinker dealt with everyone in turn, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time. He traded sharp knives for dull ones and a small coin. He sold shears and needles, copper pots, and small bottles that wives hid quickly after buying them. He traded buttons and bags of cinnamon and salt, limes from Tinu, chocolate from Tarbine, polished horn from Marua. All the while the children continued to sing, "See a man without a face, move like ghosts from place to place. What's their plan? What's their plan? Chandrian, Chandrian." Coat guessed the travelers had been together a month or so, long enough to become comfortable with each other, but not long enough to be squabbling over small things. They smelled of road dust and horses. He breathed it in like perfume. Best of all was the noise. Leather creaking, men laughing. The fire cracked and spat. The women flirted. Someone even knocked over a chair. For the first time in a long while there was no silence in the Waystone Inn, or if there was, it was too faint to be noticed, or too well hidden. Coat was in the middle of it all, always moving, like a man tending a large, complex machine, ready with the drink just as a person called for it. He talked and listened in the right amounts. He laughed at jokes, shook hands, smiled, and whisked coins off the bar as if he truly needed the money. Then, when the time for songs came, and everyone had sung their favorites and still wanted more, Coat led them from behind the bar, clapping to keep a beat. With the fire shining in his hair, he sang Tinker Tanner, more verses than anyone had heard before, and no one minded in the least. End of part 1 of chapter 3.